You never really hear about it in the newsreels, the stuff that really sticks with you. They talk about the big pushes, the strategic advances, the heroism, and God knows there was plenty of that. But they don't talk about the silence. Not the quiet of a lull in the fighting, I mean the kind of silence that grows between men, a heavy, thick thing that settles in your stomach like a bad meal. It's the silence that comes when you know something you desperately wish you didn't, and you know that every other guy in your foxhole knows it too, but no one dares give it a name. It started for us on the Eastern Front, in the mud and the freezing cold of Russia, as whispers. That's all they were at first, just whispers, like the wind through the birch trees. You'd be huddled around a miserable little stove trying to get a tin of coffee warm, your fingers so numb you could barely feel the mug, and someone, usually a guy just back from a courier run or a few days, leave to somewhere in Poland, would lean in a little closer. His voice would drop, not out of fear of the officers just then, but out of a different kind of fear, a shameful fear. He'd say he'd seen something, heard something. Train cars, not full of supplies or ammunition, but packed with people. And not just any people, but, well, you know. And they weren't just being relocated. The way he'd say it, his eyes not quite meeting yours, the way he'd trail off. At first you'd shrug it off. War is full of crazy stories. Rumors fly faster than bullets. You tell yourself it was propaganda, enemy nonsense, or just some Ririch type exaggerating. But then, a week later, you'd be on night watch with another buddy, staring out into the inky blackness, listening for the telltale scrape of a Russian patrol, and he'd mentioned something similar, a story he heard from his cousin in a different division, and the details would match. That's when the first cold trickle of dread would start, not for your own skin, but for your soul, for the very country you were supposed to be fighting for. The disbelief would slowly curdle into a sickening kind of belief. It was the small things that made it real, like the men who came back from the rear changed. I remember once we got a shipment of replacements, and a few of them weren't fresh-faced boys from home, but older guys, reassigned from some kind of guard duty. They were different. It wasn't that they were tough or battle-hardened like some of our veterans. We respected those men. This was something else. Their eyes were empty, hollow. They'd sit by themselves, not joining in the card games or the bull sessions about girls back home. They didn't laugh at the dark humor that kept the rest of us sane. They just smoked, staring at nothing. You'd try to make conversation, and they'd give you a look that made your blood run cold, a look that said they'd seen a part of the world you should be grateful you hadn't. And then there were the ones who never came back at all. Not dead, not transferred, but just gone. A buddy of mine, Klaus, a cheerful kid from Hamburg who could make a joke about anything, got reassigned to some administrative post near a place I'd never heard of, a place with a Polish name. He promised to write. For a few weeks we got letters full of the usual stuff, then they just stopped. Complete silence. Later I heard from another fellow that Klaus wasn't the same when someone saw him, that the light had gone out of him. We never talked about it openly, but we knew. There was an unspoken rule, a line you didn't cross, especially with the SS units that were sometimes attached to us. They kept to themselves, with their fancy black uniforms and their skull insignia that suddenly didn't seem so heroic anymore. You'd see them in a village, and you'd just look the other way. You didn't ask questions. You didn't want to know what they were doing in those cellars, what those long, low buildings they were so interested in were for. It was a survival instinct, but not the kind that protects you from shrapnel. It was the kind that tries to protect some last, fragile piece of your humanity. Because then came the things we saw with our own eyes, the things you couldn't explain away. The trains. God, the trains. We'd be waiting for our own transport, sitting on the embankment, and a long line of cattle cars would rumble past on the adjacent track. At first you'd think it was livestock, but then you'd see the faces, pale and gaunt, pressed against the slats. Hands sometimes reaching out through the gaps. And the smell. You never forget a smell like that. It was a sweet, sickly, foul odor of unwashed bodies and waste and something else, something metallic and rotten, that clung to the air for miles down the track, clinging to your own uniform, clinging to the back of your throat. You detasted in your coffee afterwards. That smell was the truth, and it was more powerful than any whisper. Once, in a battered village we just occupied, an old man, his face a roadmap of fear, grabbed my arm as I was on patrol. He was trembling so badly I thought he'd fall over. He spoke in a rushed, panicked Polish that I could barely understand, but his eyes said everything. He kept pointing west, making gestures, drawing a line across his throat. He kept saying one word over and over: SS, SS. My sergeant barked at me to keep moving, to shake him off, and I did. I pulled my arm away from that desperate grip and marched on, but I felt the ghost of his fingers on my sleeve for days. I saw the terror in his eyes every time I closed my own. What could I have done? What could any of us have done? We were just lancer, grunts, infantrymen. Our world was a few hundred meters of cratered earth, the man to your left and the man to your right. War was a monstrous machine, and we were tiny, insignificant cogs. To even think about protesting, about questioning, was a death sentence, not just from the enemy, but from our own. So we made a collective, unspoken decision. We looked away. We focused on the mud in front of our boots, on the rations in our pack, on the next hill to be taken. We talked about home, about our mothers, cooking, about the girls we left behind. We cracked jokes about the lousy food and the lousier weather. We did anything and everything to build a wall in our minds between us and that other, darker war happening just behind the lines. It was the only way to stay sane, to keep from just lying down in the mud and giving up. But that knowledge, that awful, unspoken secret, became a heavy burden we all carried. It changed the silence between us. A quiet moment with your comrades wasn't just peaceful anymore, it was fraught. You'd be sharing a cigarette with a buddy, and you'd catch his eye, and you'd both know what the other was thinking about, but neither of you would say a word. The fear was palpable. They called it defeatist talk, and it was a one-way ticket to a court-martial, or worse, a bullet from your own side. The political officers, the ones who were always so fervent, they were everywhere listening. So you learned to keep your mouth shut. You became an expert in saying nothing. Writing letters home was the hardest. You'd sit there with a pencil and a precious sheet of paper, trying to sound cheerful for your parents, for your sweetheart. You detail them about the beautiful countryside, omitting the burned-out farms and the mass graves. You complain about the cold, but you'd never mention the frozen corpses you used for cover in the trenches. And you'd certainly never, ever write a single word about the whispers, about the trains, about the hollow-eyed men. You construct a sanitized version of the war, a lie to protect them, and in doing so, you felt like you were betraying them and yourself. You were co-conspirator in this great, terrible silence. The weight of it was immense. You're fighting a war you started to believe was for your country's survival against an enemy that was truly brutal, and yet you're carrying this cancerous knowledge that your own side is perpetrating something monstrous. It eats away at you. You fight not out of patriotic fury, but out of a simple, desperate desire to keep the man next to you alive, and for him to keep you alive, so that maybe, just maybe, you can see home again. The cause becomes abstract, meaningless. The only thing that is real is the mud, the cold, the fear, and the friendship. The dark humor becomes a lifeline. I remember once, after a particularly nasty shelling, we were dug in a waterlogged hole, up to our knees in freezing muck. My friend France turned to me, his face plastered with dirt, and said, "You know, my mother always told me I'd end up in a ditch if I didn't study harder. I guess she was right." And we laughed, a raw, desperate sound, but it was laughter. It was that or start screaming. You clung to those tiny moments of humanity like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. The taste of a real potato someone managed to scrounge, the warmth of a shared blanket on a freezing night, the sound of a harmonica playing a familiar folk song in the darkness. Those were the things that reminded you that you were still a human being. But always, in the background, was the whisper. It was there in the way we'd suddenly stop talking when an SS officer walked past. It was there in the way we'd avert our eyes from the railway sidings. It was in the way we'd look at each other after the war, years later at reunions, and know that there was a whole part of our experience that would never be spoken aloud. We were young men, boys really, who had been taught duty and honor and obedience, and we found ourselves in the middle of a nightmare we couldn't comprehend and were powerless to stop. We fought, we bled, we watched our friends die, and all the while we carried this secret shame, this knowledge of the abyss that had opened up right beside us. It wasn't something you saw in a newsreel. It was something you felt in the pit of your stomach, a cold, hard knot that never really goes away. It's the ghost that follows you home, the silence that speaks louder than any balm. And you learn to live with it because you have to, But you never, ever forget the weight of those whispers in the Russian dark. You know, they talk about the war, the historians and the movies. They talk about the big picture, the push and pull of armies on a map. But that wasn't my war. My war was small. It was the weight of a satchel full of bandages and morphine syrettes. It was the smell of iodine and dirt and sweat. It was the sound of a man breathing, ragged and wet, when he shouldn't be breathing at all. I was a medic, a sanitator. My job was to patch up the holes, to stop the bleeding, to offer a cigarette to a kid who was shaking so bad he couldn't hold it. That was the war I knew, the one I could touch. But there was another war happening, just outside the edges of my vision. A cold, silent war that seeped into everything, especially the quiet moments. It was in the things we didn't say, the glances we exchanged, the things the wounded whispered when the fever took them. That's the part that stayed with me long after the guns went quiet. It all started with the smell. Even over the coppery stink of blood and the ripe odor of infected flesh in the aid station, you catch it sometimes on the wind, depending on which way it blew. A thick, greasy smell, like a rubbish fire, but sweeter. Wrong. We'd be hunched over a boy from Hamburg, trying to find the source of the bleeding while he cried for his mother, and that smell would drift through the cracked window of the farmhouse or the canvas flap of the tent, and for a second, everyone would just go still. No one would mention it. You just see the other medics, men like Klaus and Franz, their hands paused mid-motion, their eyes meeting yours for a fractured second before looking away, down at the wound, back to the work. It was easier to focus on the hole in front of you than the vast, unspoken hole in the world just a few miles away. We dealt in the reality of wounds. A shrapnel tear, a clean rifle hole, a crushed leg from a mortar blast. I knew how to handle that. Pressure, sulfur powder, a tourniquet if it was real bad. It was desperate, filthy work, but it was clean in its purpose. You were fighting death, one man at a time. But then the rumors started. Little fragments of horror passed from unit to unit like a cursed currency. You'd hear it from a wounded infantryman, a guy who'd been pulled from the line for a few days, his nerves shot. He'd be sitting on a crate, sipping ersatz coffee, and he'd say something quiet like, "You think it's bad here. You should see what they're doing at the camp near the town." And then he'd clam up, like he'd said too much. Or you'd hear the boys from the penal battalions, the ones sent to do the worst jobs, their faces permanently grey with a kind of existential grime. They'd mutter about things that made no sense, things that belonged in a madhouse, not a military operation. Experiments, they'd say. Doctors in clean uniforms, but not like our doctors. Ours were harried, exhausted men with blood under their fingernails, men who'd smoke a cigarette while stitching up a gut wound because there was no time for niceties. These other doctors, the rumors said, they were different, precise, cold. They were using people, prisoners, like laboratory animals, testing limits of endurance, injecting diseases, seeing how much a body could take. And the most chilling thought, the one that would coil in my gut like a cold snake, was the idea that some of these men might have been like our Dr. Haas. Haas was a good man, a tired old bear from Munich who'd lost his spectacles for the third time that week and who'd pat your shoulder and say, "We'll save this one, Erich. We'll save him," even when it was hopeless. The thought that a man who took the same oath, who swore to preserve life, could be involved in that. It made the world feel like it was made of shifting sand. It called everything into question. The aid station was its own little world, a bubble of relative safety filled with the sounds of pain and the low murmur of comfort. It was in that bubble that the whispers became voices. The guards from the camp, the SS Totenkopfverband, they'd get wounded too, shipped back to us when their positions were overrun. And when the morphine took hold or the fever spiked, their lips would get loose. They'd lie on a stretcher, their fine black uniforms cut away, and they'd look like boys again, scared and young. But the things they said, one, he couldn't have been more than 19, had a nasty chest wound. He was burning up, his pupils huge. He grabbed my wrist as I was checking his dressing, his grip surprisingly strong. They just fall over," he mumbled, his breath hot and foul. "You line them up and you tell them to march and they just fall over, like dolls. And the smell. God, the smell gets in your hair. You can't wash it out." He started crying then, quiet, helpless sobs. "I just want to go home. I just want to not smell it anymore." I pried his fingers loose and told him to rest, that he was going to be okay. But what did that even mean? Okay enough to go back to making people fall over like dolls. Another time, a big, brutish-looking sergeant, the kind of man who seemed carved from oak, was brought in with a leg full of shell fragments. He was delirious, sweating through his sheets. He kept shouting orders to people who weren't there. Faster, stack them faster, the oven can't keep up. Then he'd switch to a pleading, childish voice. No, please, I have a family, don't make me look. We had to sedate him heavily to keep him from tearing his stitches. Klaus and I would just look at each other over the man's thrashing body. No words. What words were there? The silence between us medics was heavier than any confession. We were a brotherhood, bound by the shared intimacy of other men's suffering. We knew every shade of fear on a man's face, the particular sound of a death rattle. We share our precious hoard of real coffee beans, complain about the lousy food, laugh with the dark, bleeding humor that kept you sane. Jokes about the quality of Soviet shrapnel, bets on how long the shelling would last. But we never, ever talked about the whispers. It was an agreement, a pact of silence. To speak of it would be to make it real, to acknowledge that the evil wasn't some abstract thing out there, but was being tended to by men in our own uniforms, men we were oath-bound to heal. It felt like we were keeping the machine running, you know. By patching up a guard, I was sending him back to his post. By staying silent, I was complicit. I was just one man with a bandage kit, a little tin of morphine, and a prayer. What was that against the tide of death that was rolling out of those camps? I'd look at my hands, covered in the honest grime of my work, and I'd wonder if they were clean, really clean. I clung to the small victories. Every life saved was a tiny defiance. This one kid, Helmut, he took a bullet through the lung. It was a bad one. I stayed with him for hours, listening to that awful sucking sound, keeping him on his side. I told him stories about my family's farm, about my sister's terrible cooking, anything to keep him focused, to keep him fighting. When he finally stabilized, when his breathing evened out just a little, it felt like I'd won a great battle. I'd think, okay, this one. I saved this one. Maybe it balances out one of the others. It was a foolish hope, a child's arithmetic in a world gone mad, but it was the only thing that kept me from drowning. To function, you had to build walls inside yourself. You had to focus on the task, the next bandage, the next dose of morphine. The big picture would crush you. So we created a mask of normalcy. I'd write letters home to my parents, to my little sister, Lies. I'd describe the weather, the lousy food, the beautiful, war-torn countryside. I'd tell them about the funny things, like the time we had a chicken that followed us for 2 days like a mascot until someone's stomach got the better of them. I painted a picture of hardship, but honorable hardship. I never wrote about the whispers. I never wrote about the hollowed prisoners we sometimes saw on the roads, being marched God knows where. I never wrote about the smell. I was protecting them, sure, but I was also protecting myself. Putting those words on paper would have made it all true in a way I couldn't take back. The words I did write felt like lies, and the distance between the soldier in the letters and the man I was becoming widened every day. The end of the war, for everyone else, was a day of celebration. The shooting stopped. The flags changed. For me, the war ended later. It ended when the Allies, the Americans, started making us look. They gathered us, a group of us medics and other non-combatants, and they showed us the photographs. They took us to the camps. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It wasn't a whisper in a fever dream. It was there in stark, terrible black and white. It was the piles of bones wearing skin. It was the empty, staring eyes. It was the industrial scale of it, the sheer mechanical efficiency of death. The smell I'd caught on the wind was now a suffocating blanket that clung to my clothes, my skin, my soul. I saw the ovens. I saw the bunks. And in that moment, every whispered confession, every haunted glance between me and Klaus, every silent pact crashed down on me. The war I had fought, the small war of bandages and morphine, was just a tiny, insignificant sideshow to this. I had lived and breathed and struggled in the shadow of a horror so vast I could never have conceived of it. I thought I knew death. I had held men's hands as they slipped away. But this was something else. This was a factory. I vomited until there was nothing left. I saw tough, hardened soldiers, men who'd faced Russian tanks with nothing but a Panzerfaust, break down and weep like children. And all I could think was, we knew. Not the scale, not the horror, but we knew something was happening. We whispered about it. We carried that knowledge, a sick, secret fear in our hearts, even as we tried to be decent men. That's the weight I carry. Not just the memory of the boys I couldn't save, the screams that still sometimes echo in my dreams, but the weight of that knowledge, the weight of the whispers. You go through life after that, you try to be a good man, a good husband, a good father. You tend your garden, you go to work, you laugh with your grandchildren. But there's always a part of you that's still there, in that aid station, hearing a feverish boy whisper about the smell that gets in your hair, and wondering if you could have done more, said something, anything. The war never really ends for a soldier. It just finds a quiet place to live inside you, and it whispers to you for the rest of your days. You see their faces, fresh off the truck, and it's like looking into a mirror from 3 years ago. That clean uniform, still smelling of home and mothballs, not sweat and dirt and fear. The way they hold their rifle, like it's a precious foreign object, not the grimy, all-scented extension of your own hands it becomes. Their eyes, God, their eyes still have a light in them. They haven't learned how to hollow them out yet, how to pull that shut-us-down look that keeps the worst of it from getting in too deep. We'd call them green, but it was more than that. They were still soft, like new clay, and this place, this damn war, was going to press them into a shape they could never have imagined. My buddy France would nudge me, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by too many Russian winters, and he'd just grunt, "More lambs for the slaughter hands. See if any of 'em can actually dig a hole that'll stop a shell." And that's where it started, the welcoming committee. Not with a handshake, but with a shovel. You take 'em out to the line, the air thick with the stink of wet wool and cordite, and that faint, sweet smell of decay that just hangs over everything, no matter where you are. You show them the dirt. "See this," you say, kicking at the parapet of your foxhole. "This ain't a garden plot. You dig deep. You dig until your arms feel like they're gonna fall off, and then you dig some more. You make the side straight. You reinforce it with whatever you can find, broken boards, bits of a crate, a dead man's helmet, hell, anything. This hole is your best girl now. She's the only thing that might kiss you goodnight and let you see the sunrise. You teach them the feel of the earth, the different texture-rest, sandy soil that collapses in on itself, the thick, greedy mud that tries to suck the boots right off your feet. You show them how to listen, not just with your ears, but with your whole body. The difference between the thump of an outgoing shell and the shriek of an incoming one. The way the air changes pressure just before a barrage. You point out the little things in no man's land, the slight discoloration of the grass, a patch of earth that's just a little too smooth, and you say, "That's a teller mine waiting for some idiot to get curious." You don't go exploring out there. You stay low, you stay quiet, you stay alive. But that's just the easy part, the manual they should have given you, but never did. The real lesson, the one that matters more than any field manual, comes later, whispered over a mess tin of lukewarm stew, or while sharing a cigarette, the glow of it cupped in your hand so it doesn't draw a sniper's eye. It's the lesson of what not to see, what not to ask. One of the new kids, a boy named Klaus with hair the color of straw and a nervous smile, he asked about the trains. We'd heard the rumble on the tracks a few miles east, a sound that was different from the supply trains, slower, heavier, and sometimes, if the wind was right, you'd catch a smell. A smell you couldn't place but made the hair on your neck stand up. Klaus asked, "What's on those trains? They're not heading to the front, are they?" The veterans, the old hands like me and France and Jotchen, we all just froze for a second. We shared a look. It was a whole conversation in a glance, a warning. A tired, grim understanding. France finally broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly. "Son," he said, not unkindly, "there are questions a smart soldier doesn't ask. That's one of them." And I took over, pulling the kid aside like an older brother. "Listen, Klaus, you see something that doesn't make sense. You see men in strange, striped uniforms being marched somewhere. You see those camps marked on the map as work details. You see any of the SS Totenkopfverband units with their death's head badges. You look the other way. You understand? You look down at your boots, you check your rifle, you find a reason to be busy somewhere else." He looked confused, a little offended even. "But why? What are they doing?" I had to get through to him. I grabbed his arm, not hard, but enough to make him focus. "Because curiosity gets you dead around here faster than a Russian bullet," I hissed. "You start asking those questions and the wrong people hear you. And then you're not just a soldier anymore, you're a problem. And problems get sent to the punishment battalions, clearing minefields with their feet, or they just disappear. Poof, gone on a night patrol that never comes back. Your mother gets a letter saying you died for the fatherland, and we all know the real truth, but we can't say a damn thing. So you forget the trains. You forget the smell. You focus on the man to your left and the man to your right. You make sure he gets his coffee in the morning, and you make sure you get back to this hole alive at night. That's your world now. Not the politics, not the high command, not the rumors. Just the mud, the cold, and the guy next to you. That's how you keep your sanity. That was the unspoken rule. We built a wall, not just of sandbags and logs, but a wall inside our heads. We compartmentalized everything. Over here in this box is the war, the Russians, the shelling, the fear. Over there in that box is home, memories of your girl, your mother's cooking, the smell of fresh bread. And way down deep, in a locked box you never ever open, is the stuff about the camps, the whispers, the things we saw out of the corner of our eyes. You open that box, and the rot gets out, and it poisons everything else. You can't fight, you can't hope, you can't even think straight. I learned that the hard way, back in 42. There was a guard I met, a story that still haunts me. We were pulled back for a few days of rest, if you could call it that, in some godforsaken Polish town that was more rubble than buildings. There was a tavern, just a cellar with a few tables and a barrel of gut-rot vodka that tasted like paint thinner. I was sitting with Jachin, trying to get drunk enough to forget the look on a young lieutenant's face when a mortar round took off his legs, when this guy stumbles over to our table. He was SS, but not frontline SS. His uniform was cleaner, his boots had a shine we could never manage. But his eyes were shattered. He was drunk, I mean fall down, slurring his words drunk. He had that death's head on his collar. He just collapsed into a chair and started talking, like we were his oldest friends, like he had to tell someone or he'd explode. At first it was justifications, the party line. We are purifying the Reich, a necessary hardship, the Führer's will. He smelled of cheap alcohol and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet, like old blood and disinfectant, a smell I now know was the smell of the camps, clinging to his wool coat. But then his voice broke. The bluster vanished. He looked at me and his face crumpled. Tears started cutting clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. They were just skeletons, he whispered, his voice cracking. Women, children, they'd look at you and their eyes, they weren't even eyes anymore. Just holes, empty holes. I had orders. What was I supposed to do? He started sobbing then, great, heaving sobs that shook his whole body. I can't get the smell out of my nose. I taste it in my food. My God, what have we done? Jachin and I just sat there, frozen. We didn't say a word. What could we say? We were just Lancer, grunts in the mud. This was a darkness we weren't supposed to see, a guilt so vast it felt like it could swallow the whole world. He wasn't seeking forgiveness from us. He was trying to vomit his own soul out. After a while, he staggered away, leaving a silence at our table that was heavier than any artillery barrage. Jachin finally lit a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. He took a long drag and said, "See, Hans, that's what happens. You don't want to know, you just don't." And he was right. That guard's fate, his bottomless, screaming guilt, was a contagion. It was a fear that settled deep in my gut, a cold dread that whispered, this is what we're a part of. This is happening behind us while we fight in front. And if we survive this war, will that guilt become our own? Just by knowing, by looking away, are we stained by it too? That was the real burden we carried, heavier than any pack. It created a language among us veterans, a vocabulary of silence, a shared glance when a certain topic came up, a slight shake of the head to a new guy who was getting too inquisitive, a story cut short. We spoke in code. "Don't worry about the people back there, they're handling things," someone would say, and we'd all understand the grim finality in those words. There was a perverse sense of relief when a replacement like Klaus finally learned the rule. You'd see the change in him over a few weeks. The innocent questions stopped. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by that familiar, guarded, hollow look. He'd learned to change the subject when the talk turned to things best left unsaid. He'd mastered the art of looking away at the precise moment. And part of you was glad, because it meant he was a little safer, a little more likely to make it. But another part of you, a smaller, sadder part, felt a profound grief. You watched that last bit of his innocence die, and you knew you were the one who had helped kill it. We were preserving their chance to survive, but at the cost of their souls, and by extension, our own. We were becoming curators of a horrible secret, passing on the tradition of willful ignorance to the next generation of boys, all to keep them alive long enough to carry the same terrible knowledge. That's the paradox they never tell you about. The survival instinct isn't just about dodging bullets. It's about killing a piece of your own humanity, bricking it up behind that wall in your mind, so the rest of you can keep going. You learn to find joy in the smallest, dumbest thinks a dry pair of socks, a tin of beef from the British, a letter from home that doesn't mention the war. You develop a gallows humor that would shock your mother. You joke about death because if you don't laugh at it, you'll go mad with fear. You cling to your buddies with a love deeper than any romance because they are the only tangible reality in a world gone insane. They are the warmth in the freezing foxhole, the shared cigarette in the rain, the hand that pulls you up when you slip in the mud. And you never, ever talk about what happens behind the lines. You just fight your war, the one in the mud, and you pray that if you ever do get home, you'll be able to find that locked box inside you and throw away the key for good. But you know deep down that the key is already lost, and the smell of that guard's guilt, the memory of his broken sobs, is in that box forever. The pen feels heavy in my hand, heavier than my rifle slung against this sorry excuse for a tree. It's a cheap thing, this pen, the kind you'd pick up at a drugstore back home without a second thought, but right now it might as well be made of lead. The paper is thin and already starting to crumple from the dampness in the air, the kind of damp that gets into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be truly dry again. I'm hunched over, my back against this rough bark, my boots sinking into the mud next to a little stream that's more brown than blue. It's the only sound, that gentle gurgle, and for a few precious minutes it almost drowns out the war. Almost. There's always the distant thump of artillery, a low rumble like a bad stomach ache on the horizon, a constant reminder that this quiet is just a loan, not a gift. I've been carrying this weight for weeks, this knot in my gut that gets tighter every time one of the boys lowers his voice. It's the weight of the whispers. You see things, you hear things, and there's no one you can talk to about them. Not really. You can't just come out and say it in the open, not even with the guys you trust with your life, because saying it out loud makes it real and it might just make you disappear. So it stays inside, festering, and you smile at the jokes and you drink your coffee and you try to pretend you're just fighting a war against soldiers, like in the storybooks. But I can't pretend anymore. I have to get it out. So I'm writing to you, Tommy, my big brother. Even though you're halfway across the world, probably covered in grease from that garage of yours, talking to you is the only thing that ever made sense. I know I'll burn this letter when I'm done. I have to. Sending it would be a death sentence for me and maybe for you and Ma, and that's a chance I can't take. But for these few minutes, while the squad is taking a breather 100 yards back, I need to pretend that this piece of paper can actually reach you. I need to confess. It started with the smell. War has its own smells, Tommy, smells I could never have imagined back home. The coppery tang of blood, the acrid stink of cordite that hangs in the air after a firefight, the foul odor of a latrine pit that's seen too much use. You get used to those in a horrible way. They're the smells of violence, of men killing men. But this was different. We were moving up near these train tracks, a main line, I guess, and the wind shifted. It was a sweet, sickly smell, thick, like burning rubbish, but with something else underneath, something rotten and greasy. It made your eyes water. It made Hank, tough old Hank who's seen everything, gag and spit into the mud. We all just looked at each other, nobody saying a word. What do you say? Then there are the guards. We see them sometimes, these SS boys, not the regular army fellas we trade potshots with. These ones are different. Their uniforms are always pristine, like they just stepped out of a parade. But their eyes, Tommy, their eyes are hollow. There's nothing there. No anger, no fear, not even pride. Just a flat, dead emptiness. We saw a group of them once, herding these people. I don't even know what to call them. They weren't soldiers. They were skeletons draped in striped rags, stumbling, their faces just skulls with skin stretched tight over them. One of them fell, and the guard just stood there. Didn't yell, didn't hit him, just watched with those dead eyes until the man stopped moving. It was colder than any act of violence I've ever seen, and the whispers started then. Late at night in the foxhole, when it's just you and your buddy in the darkness, voices get real quiet. You hear words like camp and ovens and final solution. At first, you think it's just rumors, war stories getting twisted, the kind of garbage that spreads like wildfire. But then you hear it from a guy who swears he saw it from a ridge, the smoke, the piles, and you remember the smell. And that's the thought that's eating me alive, the question I can't ask anyone here. What are we fighting for? I joined up to protect something. To protect home and Ma and you and the idea of a decent world. But if this is what's on the other side of the hill, if this is what we're supposedly protecting Europe from the Reds or whoever else they tell us, then what the hell are we protecting? Are we saving people from this, or are we just delaying it? Or, God help me, are we somehow a part of it by just being here and not screaming it from the rooftops? I feel like I'm losing my grip on what's right and wrong. It's all just shades of grey mud and the stink of death. My hand is shaking as I write this, not from fear of the shells, but from fear of this paper. I look over my shoulder, even though I know I'm alone. You hear stories, not from the enemy, but from our own side. A guy in the 3rd Battalion, they say, wrote a letter home saying the war was lost, that we were just cannon fodder. The letter never made it. He never made it either. They said it was a sniper, but the way the officers looked at him the day before, you get a sense for these things. Disloyalty, defeatism, that's what they'd call this. They'd call it treason. So I scratch out a sentence, then I rewrite it, my handwriting getting messier, more desperate. I need to put the words down. I need to see them, even if only for a second, to prove to myself that I haven't gone crazy, that what we're whispering about is real. It's a catharsis. I think that's the word Sister Agnes would have used back in school. A cleansing. But it's a dangerous one. I think of you getting a visit from the MPs, of Ma's face. I couldn't do that to you. This burden is mine to carry. This knowledge is my own personal hell. So I write it all down, every terrible whisper, every hollow-eyed glance, every gag-inducing wave of that foul air. I pour it onto this flimsy page, and with every word I feel a little bit of that crushing weight lift from my chest, even as the risk grows. The lighter is cold in my other hand. It's a Zippo, a good one. I traded a pack of Lucky Strikes for it from a Marine in London. It flares to life with a familiar click and a soft whoosh. I hold the corner of the paper to the flame. For a second, nothing happens, and then a thin line of orange creeps up the edge. The paper curls inward, blackening, the words I just poured my soul into vanishing into smoke. My dearest brother Tommy turns to ash. The description of the hollow-eyed guards disappears. The question, what are we fighting for, is swallowed by the fire. I watch it until the heat bites my fingers, and I have to drop the last fragment into the mud at my feet. It sits there for a second, a black, crumpled flower, before the drizzle puts it out for good. And a strange peace settles over me. It's not a happy peace, not the peace of winning or of going home. It's the peace of a man who's finally confessed his darkest secret, even if it was only to the void, to this muddy stream and the uncaring trees. The weight isn't gone, but it's bearable now. I've acknowledged it. I've given it a shape, and then I've destroyed that shape. I made a promise to myself, watching those embers die. I will never forget this. I will never forget the smell, the whispers, the hollow eyes. Even if I can never speak of it again, even if I have to lock it away deep inside me for the rest of my life, I will remember, because someone has to. I stub the ashes deeper into the mud with my boot, erasing the last evidence. Then I stand up, my knees cracking, and sling my rifle back over my shoulder. The war is waiting. The guys will be wondering where I got to. I'll go back, and I'll smile at Smitty's dumb joke, and I'll drink the bitter coffee, and I'll be a soldier again. But a part of me will always be here, by this stream, confessing to a brother who will never hear it, burning the truth to keep us both safe. The mud had a way of getting into everything, not just your boots and your uniform, but into your soul. It was this cold, greasy clay that clung to you, a constant reminder that you were in a place you were never meant to be. I was just a kid from Hamburg, a boy who'd never fired a rifle before they shoved one in my hands and put me on a train east. You learn fast, or you don't learn at all. That's the first rule. The second rule is that the mud doesn't care about your rules. This particular day, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the artillery barrages. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, cordite, and something else, something sweet and rotten that you tried not to think about. We were hunkered down in our positions along this godforsaken stretch of the front, facing the Russians, and the word came down the line on a whisper, passed from foxhole to foxhole like a secret. A truce. A temporary ceasefire to collect the wounded from no man's land. You didn't believe it, not at first. You'd heard stories, tricks, men shot while trying to help a comrade. But then the firing really did stop. The silence was deafening, a ringing in your ears that was louder than the war itself. Cautiously, we rose up out of the muck, a few of us at a time, our hands empty, our rifles slung. And across the way, they did the same. The Russians emerged from their trenches like ghosts, men in brownish uniforms, just as filthy, just as hollow-eyed as we were. That was the first thing that struck me, the sheer weariness in their faces. It was a mirror of our own. There was no hatred in that moment, just a shared, exhausted understanding. We moved slowly, stepping over the craters and the tangled wire, the ground littered with the awful things war leaves behind. I saw one of their soldiers, a big fellow with a thick black beard, kneeling next to one of our wounded, a boy from my company named Klaus. Klaus was moaning softly, and the Russian was trying to get a bandage around his leg. Our medic, Franz, rushed over and they worked together, wordlessly, their hands speaking a language that needed no translation. I made eye contact with another Russian, a young one, couldn't have been more than 17. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and there was nothing to say. We were just two kids stuck in a nightmare made by old men. He nodded, just a slight dip of his chin, and I found myself nodding back. In that unspoken truce, we weren't enemies. We were just survivors, sharing a moment of humanity in the middle of hell. You could smell the damp wool of their greatcoats, hear their low, guttural voices as they called out to each other. It didn't sound so different from our own. That's the thing they never tell you, the sameness. The same cold, the same fear, the same longing for home. It reminded me of something that had happened a few weeks earlier, something that had been eating away at me. We'd captured a Russian scout during a night patrol. He was a wiry, tough-looking man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wasn't scared, just resigned. We were interrogating him, or trying to, but none of us spoke more than a few words of Russian. The lieutenant was getting frustrated, waving his pistol around, demanding to know about troop positions. The Russian just stared past him, past our whole line, back towards our own rear areas. He had this look on his face, not of anger at us, but of something else, something darker. Then he slowly raised his hands, made a cutting motion across his own throat, and pointed firmly back the way we had come. He wasn't pointing at our army, at the regular lancer like me and my buddies. He was pointing further back to where the command posts were, to where the black uniforms were. The SS, the political officers. The lieutenant had gone quiet, his bluster gone. He understood, too. We all did. That gesture, that universal symbol of death, was meant for the men behind us, the ones who enforced the party's will with a bullet to the back of the head if you so much as thought about retreating. The Russian spat on the ground, a look of pure contempt on his face, and that contempt wasn't for us. It was for them, the common enemy. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Here was this man, our prisoner, and in that moment we had more in common with him than we did with the men in our own high command. We both feared the same shadow, the one that stood behind you, watching, always watching. We shared a hatred for the men who saw soldiers as nothing more than pawns, expendable for a cause none of us common grunts really believed in anymore. We just wanted to see our families again. That shared dread created a bond, a silent acknowledgement that the real fight wasn't always across the wire. Sometimes, the real danger was the boot heel pressing down on your own neck. That memory was swirling in my head as we finished gathering our wounded. The truce was holding, but it was fragile, like thin ice. You could feel the tension returning. As we turned to carry Klaus back to our lines, I glanced once more at the young Russian soldier. He was helping his comrades with their own wounded. Our eyes met again, and for a split second it was like looking at a brother. Then the moment was over. We retreated to our ditches, back into the mud, and the strange, quiet peace dissolved back into the uneasy silence of the front. But that feeling, that connection, it didn't go away. It lingered, and it found its voice a few nights later. It was a dead, quiet night, the kind where every sound carries for a mile. I'd hear a dog barking in some distant village, the wind rustling through the blasted trees. We were on watch, me and my buddy Helmut, passing a cigarette back and forth, trying to stay awake. Then out of the darkness a voice. It was accented, rough but clear. "Deutsch soldier," it called out. We froze. Helmut grabbed his rifle, but I put a hand on his arm. There was no malice in the voice. It was just a voice. "We are here," I called back softly, not wanting to draw the attention of an officer. There was a pause. "You have families," the voice came again. "Yes," I answered. "In Hamburg." He said something in Russian to his comrades, then came back to me. "I am from Stalingrad." The name alone sent a shiver through me. We'd all heard the stories, the meat grinder. "It is bad there," he said, and it wasn't a question, it was a statement. We talked like that for a while, shouting whispers across the 100 meters of death that separated us. He asked about the weather in Germany, I asked about the snow in Russia. It was surreal, this conversation between enemies. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. His voice dropped, even though it was already a whisper. "The camps," he said. "The camps you have. For Jews, for us. This is true." The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard things, of course. Whispers, rumors. You'd see the black uniforms loading people onto trains. You'd try not to think about it. You had your own survival to worry about. But hearing it thrown at you like that, from the other side, it made it real. It stripped away all the denial. A wave of shame washed over me, a hot, personal shame, as if I myself had built those places. I couldn't answer. My throat closed up. What could I say? That I was sorry. That I was just following orders. The excuses sounded pathetic, even in my own head. The silence stretched out, and he must have understood. Then his voice came back, low and firm, with a terrible finality. "We know," he said, "and we are coming for them." Those words. "We are coming for them." They didn't feel like a threat aimed at me. They felt like a promise. A grim, awful promise. And in that moment I knew he was right. They were coming. And a part of me, a part I was ashamed to acknowledge, felt a grim sense of hope. Maybe they would finish what we were too afraid to start. Maybe they would deal with the monsters in the black uniforms. The chill that went through me wasn't from fear of the Russians. It was from the terrifying clarity of it all. We were all trapped in this machine, but some of us were also the grease that kept it running, and the realization of that was the most frightening thing of all. The moment was shattered by the sudden, piercing shriek of a flare rocketing into the sky. It burst into a brilliant, sickly green light, illuminating the entire nightmare landscape in an eerie glow. The truce, the whispered conversation, the fleeting humanity was over. The signal, back to war. Almost instantly, the night erupted with the crack of rifles and the stutter of machine guns. I ducked down into the foxhole, my heart hammering against my ribs. The spell was broken. We were soldiers again, enemies again. I grabbed my Mauser, the cold metal familiar in my hands, and peered over the parapet. The green light was fading, casting long, dancing shadows. I saw movement in the Russian trench, figures scrambling. My training took over. I raised my rifle, nestled the stock against my cheek, and sighted down the barrel. I found a target, a dark shape moving against the earth. My finger rested on the trigger, but I couldn't pull it. I was thinking about the Russian's voice. I was thinking about the young soldier from the truce, the one I'd shared a glance with. Was that him out there? Was I about to kill the man who had told me, "We are coming for them"? The thought made me sick. This was the madness of it all. They were forcing us to kill the only people who understood our predicament, the only ones who saw the real enemy standing behind us, the ones with the power of life and death over all of us, German and Russian alike. I aimed my rifle, but I didn't fire. I just watched. Around me, the battle raged, a cacophony of violence that felt suddenly meaningless. The real war wasn't this exchange of bullets across a field. The real war was a silent one, a war of conscience, a war against the darkness that had consumed our own country. We were just pawns in a game we didn't understand, forced to fight a shadow war while the true architects of the horror sat safely in their offices, writing the orders that sent us to kill each other. I finally lowered my rifle and slid back down into the mud. Helmut looked at me, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Why didn't you shoot?" he hissed. I just shook my head. I couldn't explain it. How could I tell him that I was more afraid of the men in the black uniforms than I was of the Russians? That the whisper across the wire had shown me a truth more terrifying than any battle. We sat there in that hole, listening to the war happen above us, and I knew then that I wasn't fighting for the fatherland anymore. I was just fighting to get home. And I had a grim hope, a small, shameful ember in my heart, that maybe the Russians really would come. Maybe they would tear down the whole rotten system. It was a terrible thing for a soldier to wish for, the victory of his enemy, but in that moment it felt like the only hope for any kind of justice, the only way to cleanse the shame that now felt as permanent as the mud on my uniform. The firing eventually died down, returning to the sporadic potshots of a normal night. but something had changed in me forever. The front line wasn't just between two armies anymore. It was right there, inside my own head.